Hello again. In this video, we're going to look at George Harrison's first solo album. I don't mean All Things Must Pass. I mean the real first George Harrison solo album from 1968, Wonderwall music. First, let's look at exactly what Wonderwall music is. It's an album of incidental music that George created for a movie called Wonderwall. The movie is about a studious scientist who lives in a crowded apartment full of books and stuff, and he spends all his time peering through this microscope. But one day he discovers a hole in the wall through which he can see into the neighbor's place, and he starts obsessively watching them, and they're nothing at all like he is. Most fascinating for him, maybe, is the sexy hippie girl who lives there. Her boyfriend and her other friends they visit for these wild psychedelic parties. It's their happening, baby, and it freaks them out. Visually, Wonderwall is a lot of fun to watch. Most of the movie takes place in the scientist's apartment and the next door one. Both of those sets were designed by The Fool, a group of Dutch musicians and artists who, famously, did design work for the Beatles, including the inner sleeve of the Sgt. Pepper vinyl album, as well as the wall outside the Apple offices in London. Well, at least until locals complained and they had to paint over it in white. Still, it was up there for about 6 months, and to move from psychedelic to white was matched by the Beatles album covers anyway. One more quick thing. The clothes that the Beatles wore for the I Am the Walrus sequence in Magical Mystery Tour, also designed by The Fool. The movie Wonderwall is also pretty overtly basically an excuse for these mesmerizing extended psychedelic montages, full of weird shadows and colors and stuff. Early psych video art, accompanied by George Harrison's weird dreamy music. The movie is very much of its time, but it's very, very well done, and I love it. I recommend it highly. The front cover of Wonderwall Music, the album, reflects the basic theme of the movie. So there's a man traditionally, maybe stuffily dressed, separated from these bucolic scenes of hedonistic abandon by a big, thick wall. But there's one brick missing. George agreed to do music for Wonderwall in October 1967 after the movie's director, Joe Massett, promised him not only total creative control, but that he would use whatever George gave him in the film. So George recorded the music over the next few months, starting less than 2 weeks after the Magical Mystery Tour project was finished. George would later say he could barely remember Magical Mystery Tour due to his intake of LSD. This, then, is the George that we get on Wonderwall music. But the project also coincided with George's disaffection with guitar-based pop music and his embrace of Indian music. So this album, basically, overall, is full of short pieces, nearly all instrumental. It blends Indian music and musical ideas with Western ones. And the balance of Indian versus Western kind of changes from track to track. Now, personally, I'd always known that Wonderwall music existed, but I'd never actually heard it until a few days ago. I listened to it in the headphones, and I have to say that I was very impressed. The entire album is great. The music is genuinely engrossing, bursting with lots of creative ideas and psychedelic flourishes and atmospheric drones. The Western pieces are just as charming. One of the tracks, Skiing, even features Ringo Starr and Eric Clapton, so if you're a completist for either of them, well, now you have to get Wonderwall music too. George said that he planned the pieces for Wonderwall by running the movie with a stopwatch, writing down the times for the scenes he had to score, and then he'd go into the studio, first a little bit in London and then in Bombay, and record them with various musicians. Then he'd go back and play the music as the movie ran, and he found that the scenes inevitably synced up perfectly with the music, like it was all meant to happen. Now, most people know about certain Beatles esoterica, like John and Yoko's experimental albums, maybe even Paul McCartney's Thrillington, but Wonderwall music by George Harrison is one that, if you're into the vibe of George's ultra-psychedelic and Indian-infused 1967 work with the Beatles, you really should hear, and it's something you can go back and listen to often. Wonderwall music came out on Apple Records and was the first album on the Beatles' new label. It was released on November 1st, 1968, just 3 weeks before the White Album, and 4 weeks before John and Yoko's infamous Two Virgins. And by the way, looking back now, we should remember the Beatles-related historical context for Wonderwall music. So George had only had one song each on Sgt. Pepper and Magical Mystery Tour. Those songs, the slow, dreamy oozing Within You, Without You, and the similarly dense and psychedelic Blue Jay Way, both of which I love, they were the last music the world heard from George until the White Album, almost. And during that apparent year off, the Beatles had gone to India and come back, and George had fallen back in love with the guitar, and he started writing pop and rock songs again. So Wonderwall music is, from the perspective of a Beatles fan, a revelatory peek at the idiosyncratic creativity that was swirling around in the quiet Beatles' head in late 1967 and early 1968, and I'm glad he made this music. If George Harrison hadn't done this soundtrack, then this hidden era of his musical development would probably have been undocumented. Almost. The world did hear from George during that year off with the song The Inner Light, the B-side of the Beatles' Lady Madonna, which was issued in March 1968 to tide fans over while the group was in India. The Inner Light was actually recorded, this is interesting, during the Wonderwall music sessions in Bombay, and was only later reassigned to be a Beatles song. George added the lead vocals back in London and John and Paul background harmonies on the final line. The Inner Light was George's first song to be on any Beatles single and was the only Beatles song ever recorded outside of Europe. And I don't know how exactly it went from a Wonderwall song to a Beatles song, but it does make me wonder if the other Beatles were listening to Wonderwall music as it was being created in the studio and maybe even offering feedback to George or something like that. So Wonderwall music has been remastered and reissued with bonus tracks. However you hear it, I hope you like it as much as I do. And P.S. Yes, Oasis called their song that after this album and movie. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more Beatles solo album overviews, and I'll see you next time.